Okay, so this field of textual criticism, who is like the biggest skeptic in this field?
Yeah, so there's a guy by the name of Bart Ehrman, who whenever we're talking about the text of Scripture, the manuscript tradition, and all of those things, he was an evangelical Christian, or proclaimed himself to be an evangelical Christian, went and studied at university and all of that, and as he studied the text of Scripture and as he studied a number of other things about the teaching of Jesus, and primarily about the problem of evil, he then turned away from the faith. And so he does not believe in the faith anymore. And he then decided to write a bunch of different books that all demonstrated in his mind, the fact that there's all these variants. And so all these variants then undermine the inspiration of Scripture. And he says, if God spoke in his word to us, then he would have preserved his word for us. That's kind of his essential thing that I've heard him say many different times as I've listened to him. He wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, and he essentially says that what we have now is a misrepresentation of Jesus at the time, or at least we cannot be sure. We cannot be confident. We cannot be certain that this is actually representative of the Jesus that walked the earth, which is just not true. And he himself says this about his own research and about his own argument in the book Misquoting Jesus. And his professor was a guy named Professor Metzger, who Metzger argues that the message of Jesus and the message of the New Testament is preserved within the manuscript tradition. And we know what Jesus said. We know what the New Testament authors wrote when they wrote it. And so we don't have to have, we don't have any reason to fear textual criticism or anything like that, is what Professor Metzger argues. And so the argument is kind of between Professor Metzger and Bart Ehrman. And here's what Bart Ehrman says. And in this conversation, he says, if he and I, so speaking about Professor Metzger and I, were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like. So if they had to sit down and be like, all right, let's try to reconstruct the autograph of what the original text was, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. So this is his own admission that, what we have in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, how many manuscripts we have, if we compare all those together, we can reconstruct the original message of Christianity that was written. And so the main guy, the main opponent that defected from the faith, is no longer Christian, the whole thing, that wrote books that have sold hundreds of thousands of copies, the whole thing, he's like, we do have the ability to know what the early church taught.